Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's policy discussion on the female vote, conservatives' role in this year's Centennial celebration. My name is Sophie Trinetsky, and I'm the Campus Program Fellow here at the Network of Enlightened Women. And I'm honored today to be joined by Becky Norton Dunlop. Thank you so much for joining us, Mrs. Dunlop.
Hi, glad to be here.
So just a little bit about Mrs. Dunlop's extensive background. Becky Norton Dunlop is a prominent leader, strategist, and counselor in the conservative movement. She is the Heritage Foundation's Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow. Mrs. Dunlop, who joined the leading think tank in 1998, holds the only policy chair in the country to officially be named for the 40th president. Mrs. Dunlop was a senior official in the Reagan administration inside the White House, at the Justice Department, and at the Interior. During Reagan's second term, Dunlop served as a senior special assistant to the then Attorney General in charge of managing cabinet-level domestic policy issues. She oversaw major policy reports on the environment, the family, federalism, tort reform, privatization, and welfare reform. She completed her service in the Reagan administration as Deputy Undersecretary of the Interior Department and as an Assistant Interior Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Mrs. Dunlop is one of the few insiders from the beginning of the Reagan era who remain active in public policy leadership. So, Mrs. Dunlop, your background is very extensive and impressive, spanning the Reagan administration from being inside the White House, the Justice Department, the Interior Department, the American Conservative Union, Secretary of Natural Resources for Virginia, and much more. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivates you to stay politically active?
Well, first of all, let me say how delighted I am to see you, even online, and to be with these wonderful ladies today who are going to be leading our nation into the next challenge that we have after we all recover from this pandemic period. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today, and we have some great questions to discuss. The one you just raised, I think, for me is a fun one because it really goes back for me to my faith. I mean, I got motivated to be in the political arena because of my personal faith. I wanted to help people. And I'm sure a lot of people decide what they're going to do in their professional careers for similar reasons. But ultimately, I decided the best way to help people was to help them have freedom. Because if you have freedom, you can choose what to do with your life, how your family's going to live, that you can live according to your beliefs. And so that's what motivated me to get involved in politics, was to try to advance freedom around the world. And I have been involved a long time. And I think, when the good Lord calls you to a work, he equips you and makes you passionate about it. And so it's easy for me to say excited and interested in politics through the ups and downs of the political world because I'm passionate about helping humans have more freedom. And it's my vocation is also my avocation, I guess I can say. So I love what I do, and that doesn't mean you don't have bad days, as we all do. But it does mean that you kind of wake up every day thinking, well, what can I do today to be helpful to someone?
Yeah, that's very true. I couldn't agree more with that. And what a nice thing to have your passion also be your vocation. One of the ideas that you advocate for is that people are policy. So how do conservative women fit into this?
Well, that is a challenge that we face, that I think that the new organization is entirely well equipped to help us answer. We need to have people who know what they believe and why they believe it lead our policy world today. And one of the challenges in just politics per se is a lot of people get involved in politics because they grew up in a Republican family or a Democrat family, and they just like they like to engage in the battle, or they like to engage in the interpersonal relationships. But I'm involved because I'm a conservative. And so what I want to do is advance conservative principles every day. And I'm always looking for people who know what they believe and become very adept, very talented, very good at advancing principles in a variety of ways. And that's why we say in the conservative world that people are policy, because you don't want people who just like politics, who just want to be in office or get people into office for power reasons, but you want to advance these policies that we believe so strongly in. And if you don't have the right people in place, then you won't be successful in advancing policies. I often tell young women that the quickest way to advance your policy ideas is to get involved in politics and either get yourself elected or get other people who share your beliefs elected. Because in America, in the United States, policy gets put into place through our political system. And so we're always on the hunt in the conservative movement for people who love the idea of being involved in politics, which means they have a good temperament for the political world, which can be pretty nasty, as we've seen, but also know what they believe and why they believe it and want to advance these ideas.
Yeah, and I really like that you mentioned, voting for people, because I think you either have people that are very excited about politics and then you have the people that think that their vote doesn't really matter, which brings us to the next question of this year being America's 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment becoming law, which gave women the right to vote. So why is this celebration so important for us?
Well, I think there are a couple reasons why this is important. One, it actually emphasizes that the United States of America and our founding fathers were unique in that they wrote a constitution that allowed for change. In most countries in the world, you really can't change the form of government or things about the government unless you take control of the entire government. In the United States of America, our founders knew that people were not perfect. One of our founders talked about if men were angels, we wouldn't need governance. Well, the idea of our Constitution as it has played out is that women did not have the right to vote at the founding of our nation. And as time passed, and I would say a great reason is because people who actually understood that all individuals are important began to realize that not allowing women to have the right to vote was unfair. It was not a good policy. It needed to be changed. And because of our Constitution and the way that it's written and the ability that we have to amend it, the people who were then running our country could actually see this change take place. And believe me, it didn't take place just because women were involved. There had to be a lot of men who thought women deserved the right to vote too, in order for that amendment to be passed. So I think the importance of the amendment, there are many reasons why it's important, but one reason is to celebrate the Constitution, that the Constitution is written for a people who recognize that there can be mistakes of the past that can be corrected through our constitutional process, and that women are important, valuable, and precious, and they deserve the right to vote, and eventually they got the right to vote. Now we need to work every day to make sure that all the women who are involved in America understand the importance of this Constitution.
Yeah, that's very true. And that actually brings me to my next question, because as a conservative female, a lot of the time I hear that, you should be thanking the left because the left is the reason that you have your right to vote, and you're a female, you should be voting with the left, and, trying to push this liberal narrative. But why and how on campus and in the workplace can we counter that narrative that not only is it a celebration for all women, because not all women are liberal, but that you can be conservative and celebrate this too?
Well, I think it goes to the underlying view that women States of America, we view the individual as important. That is a conservative philosophy. That is not a liberal philosophy. The liberal philosophy is classes. They are groupthink. It's the conservative principles that focus on the importance of the individual. And a lot of people forget that. And of course, the other element here is that conservatives believe in governing by principles. We support the rule of law. We know, again, that men and women are not perfect, but we have each given up some of our rights to allow governments to be created for the purpose of preserving our rights, our God-given rights. And conservative women have probably a greater role of importance in advancing this narrative, because the left is always trying to make women dependent upon the government for stuff. We, however, conservative women, we are strong women. You have to be strong to be a conservative, and you have to be really strong to be a conservative woman. We understand the importance of human freedom. It's not easy, it's a challenge, but we want the right, we want the freedom to make our own choices. Sometimes they're mistakes, many times they're great successes. And I think conservative women, particularly women who associate themselves with an organization like NEW, recognize that you have really a moral responsibility to become the best person that you can be, and to understand, and not necessarily to be able to win over your whole campus, but to recognize that there are going to be hard left statists, probably about 30% of the American people. They want government to run everything as long as they're in charge of the government. And then there are about 30% of the people who strongly believe in freedom. Oftentimes they call themselves libertarians, but conservatives, fusionists, but they are the hardcore 30%. So that's 60% of the American people. That means there are 40% who are listening always and trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. And our job, your job, NEW's job, is to make sure that the young women whose inclination is to liberty, whose inclination is to the importance of the individual and personal responsibility and self-government, actually have the intellectual underpinning to persuade not those hard left statists. We're never going to win those people, but the people who are seeking, who instinctively believe what we believe, but have never really heard it articulated, or don't want to be attacked because, the statists will attack anybody, as we have seen. If you're not in agreement with them, they will attack you professionally, they will attack you personally, they will try to destroy your self-esteem, they'll try to destroy you. And so we have a responsibility as conservative women to really get a very thorough and clear understanding of what we believe and why we believe it, and then begin to tackle these 40% in the middle. They might be in your sorority, they might be in clubs that you belong to on campus, they might be a fellow student in an economics course or something, or in a constitutional course. I tell you, I remember one time I was at a lecture on Capitol Hill. It was a very interesting lecture. And a young man raised his hand and asked a question and did not get a good response from the speakers. And afterwards, as he walked out of the room, I followed him out. I said, "Excuse me, can I stop you for a minute?" And I said, "I heard the question that you asked. And let me just say to you that people need to understand the difference between their principles and their preferences." And then I explained to him how that was important. We don't know everybody's preferences in the history of our country and the constitutional debates, but when they got right down to the nitty-gritty, we knew what their principles were. And they weren't going to compromise their principles, but they had been willing to give up on some of their preferences. And these are the kinds of conversations that you can have with people that aren't necessarily political, but help them to understand why, again, our nation is unique, because we have principles that guide us. The rule of law is a principle that guides us. And we can compromise on our preferences, but we need to bring that 40% over to where they're, if not willing to tell a pollster they're with us, or at least willing to go out and vote for their principles. And that's why it's just very important that your organization helps to educate and provide that intellectual foundation for the women who are attracted to new.
I love that answer so much. That was such a great inspirational pep talk. I think not only did I myself need to hear, but definitely the other women hearing, especially with us going back to campus and the political climate that we're in. I think that was such great words of wisdom for the people that are watching. So thank you for that. And then we just have one last question before we get into Q&A from the audience. So as a conservative woman, how should we remember and honor the women and men that fought so hard for women to have the right to vote in America? Having served in 2 presidential administrations for President Ronald Reagan and President George W. Bush, how has the fact that women now have the right to vote today influenced policy and politics?
Well, that's a challenging question. And the reason I say that is because in the Reagan administration, we dealt with what they called then the gender gap. Why wasn't President Reagan getting as much support among women in America as he was among men? And many of us who were in the administration spent time trying to analyze this and discern what the reasons were. We had a lot of women in senior appointments who were going out across the country and speaking and talking about how President Reagan afforded responsibility to everyone. He didn't pick and choose based on gender, but it was always a challenge. And of course, the same thing was the case in the Bush administration. And I think the same thing is the case now in the political arena. Why isn't the person who's perceived as a conservative Republican able to win the votes, as much support among women as among men? And it's a challenge that we face, when you're a conservative in the political world, that you really have to analyze and study, because we want to elect people to office who not only get a majority of the vote, but have a huge following among all of the people in the district or in the country. And I think that we need to identify, and I think this is a great opportunity and challenge for the women of New. We need to identify individuals, and you have to actually be proactive in looking for women, minorities, and men with certain characteristics that you can actually champion and talk about how they have made a difference. A lot of the women whose support fluctuates when it comes to conservative candidates are swayed in a number of ways. One is a lot of them are from the suburbs, and so they have great sensitivity toward the people they feel are downtrodden. And if they feel that a politician or a political candidate isn't showing enough empathy or enough sympathy or enough consideration for the downtrodden, it's off-putting, but it's emotional. It's emotional. And we have to find ways to communicate with these people on the basis of what's good for our country and what's good for future generations. Because the thing that they care the most about is their children. And a lot of times they're not thinking about the fact that the emotion that they might feel about a particular politician is not the same as what they should feel about the policies that are being put into place. And it really takes people like the new women who have these understandings to go out and speak and communicate effectively with different groups different groups of women who have different concerns in the world of electoral politics, so that they can help bring them from this kind of esoteric emotional feeling to what really matters in this election, and what really matters when it comes to a particular policy. And a lot of times you can do that on the basis of talking about, well, how do you treat your children? I mean, you discipline your children, right? Most of them do. Well, discipline is required in our political system. So it really comes down to thinking in a way, you have to have your principles right, and then you have to think of strategies to effectively communicate with people who are not part of the discussion that we're having, the political discussion, the philosophical discussion we're having. So you have to find people that you can relate to, that they can relate to. I remember my father was a minister, and I very well remember him saying to me one day, I forget exactly what the conversation was about, but his message to me was, you have to meet people where they are. And that's our responsibility as conservatives. It's not the responsibility of the 40% of the American people who haven't yet decided where they're going to be on the political front to come to us. It's our job to figure out how to communicate effectively with them. And so that sometimes requires us to get a little bit out of our comfort zone. You need to look around. Every one of us needs to look around and see, where can I find a group of women or a woman of influence where I might be able to go and have a conversation or have a dialogue or have a discussion, that I can actually find principles that we have in common, and then show them how those principles are actually conservative principles. So it's an enormous responsibility for those of us who are principled conservative women to find the role models. One of the things I have on my bookshelf, by the way, is I have a whole row of books about women throughout history who have been great leaders for freedom. And I find them everywhere. I'll hear about them, or someone will mention a woman to me and I'll go find the book about her. I always want to be able to say, here's a woman who fought communism. Here's a woman who stood up against communism in the Soviet Union. Here's a woman who was a leader when Hawaii was not a state. And Deborah in the Old Testament was a judge. Did you know that? So we have to find women and individuals who actually help us explain our principles to people who are in that 40% of people who need to be persuaded that conservative principles are the best governing principles for our country.
Yeah, I think you definitely touched on a strategic point there that a lot of us forget about. We go to, fight for the people that aren't moving their viewpoints at all, and then get discouraged when they don't join our side. But we forget about the bigger picture with that. And I know you touched on the outreach a little bit, but going off of that, how do we encourage and motivate our fellow women that maybe aren't registered to vote or don't vote to actually go out to the polls?
Well, I think, everyone has to have their own strategy. But one of the points that I think we must make, particularly, well, to anyone, but particularly to women who are inclined to say, well, my vote doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is, you are a citizen of the United States of America, and it is your responsibility to cast your ballot, even if you think it doesn't matter. There are many elections in this country that are won by very few votes. So I'm willing to argue that every vote does matter. But even if your vote doesn't matter, I'll give you an example. I spoke to some people from Oklahoma recently. Oklahoma is what you would call a red state. Oklahoma has gone Republican for years and years and years and years. And there are many people in Oklahoma who therefore don't vote. They say, well, my vote doesn't matter because it's going to go Republican, which means the Republican will get all the electoral votes. And yet, what is one of the big divisive debates that's gone on in this nation since Trump was elected president. He didn't win the popular vote. Now, in our system, the Electoral College is the right solution for our country. It's the fairest thing for our country. But the statists, the leftists, can always say, well, Trump didn't win the popular vote. So I say to people in Oklahoma, your state might go red, but every vote counts. Because if you vote, if everybody in Oklahoma votes, it means that the popular vote will be closer, and that will be good for America. So I think that we need to impress upon citizens, to be a good citizen, you must go vote, whether you think your vote counts or not. And secondly, to look for examples where 1 or 2 votes did make a difference. There are those examples. And then 3, look at that topic about the Electoral College and say, if every American voted, we wouldn't be having this discussion about popular vote versus Electoral College. But the Electoral College was a brilliant creation so that people in Rhode Island would have the same, their votes would have the same value as the people in California. Because after all, we don't want California and New York deciding our elections. We want every American to feel like they've had a fair chance of having their vote heard and considered in the presidential election.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Do you have any tips for how to talk about this with fellow women on campus, especially when it can be intimidating to ask someone what their political leaning is?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to remember that our views are, they're very popular with the silent majority, but the loud minority can be very intimidating. So in that sense, you have to kind of look for ways to get into discussions that allow you to, in your own mind, go into a discussion knowing that if the person that you're speaking to becomes hostile, then you just want to have a friendly way to get out of the discussion. So you kind of have to think that through in your own mind. But the other thing is to come up with maybe a Socratic method of asking questions of people about things that they care about and believe. And one of the things I love about the internet, which was, by the way, not invented by Al Gore, but one of the things I love about the internet, it has actually caused human freedom to blossom. Can you think young people your age today have the attitude really that you can start a business, you can have an internet business, you don't need to have a bricks and mortar storefront, but because of the internet, you have instant communications, you can start a business, you can have a product or service and sell it online. You have much more freedom. One of the big challenges that we have in the world today is that the communist Chinese government is stopping the internet from being pervasive on that continent. So most of the Chinese people are limited in what they know about the outside world. So we have much more freedom because of the internet. And I think that has led young people your age to say, oh, well, we don't need government that much. And that's a very good thing. That's a very good thing. No taxing of the internet has led to an explosion of entrepreneurship and small businesses. When you tax something, you get less of it. So, that's just a conversation starter you can have with people, just start talking about the internet. Don't you think the internet has made us much more free? And find a book or something about one of these women I'm talking about who made a huge difference in the world. I know that you do a lot of book discussions in New, and I think this is one thing that you can do is find books that have heroine who help advance liberty and have a discussion. Then you can invite people who aren't necessarily political to come and talk about women who have done great things for humankind in our world today.
You keep talking about your book collection. I'm very excited to hear your answer to this. What is your favorite book, or what are some of these books about these important female that you recommend young conservatives read?
Well, I don't know that I have really a favorite book. I told my husband this morning I'm reading about 4 of them right now. I like to read fiction, so I enjoy a good murder mystery, and I love Agatha Christie. Like, she was a great writer. So any book by Agatha Christie is going to be a great book. And I'll tell you something, fiction writers have to be really, really, really smart to put all these plots together that we don't figure out until the last 2 pages. So, but there, for instance, there's a book called Eleni, E-L-E-N-I. And Eleni was a woman who lived during World War II in Greece. And it's a great story. Her son wrote it. He came to America and became I think a writer for the New York Times back in the day, when the New York Times was a more respectable paper. But Eleni stood up against the communists, and it's the story of her life, and it's just very inspiring. And then there is a book, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to be able to think of these right off the top of my head, but what I will do is I will come up with a list of 10 books about women through history that I think your organizations would find of interest. And then your committee, your steering committee, can look at them and say, all right, we're going to pick 2 of these books this year that we're going to talk about in our organization. But there are many, and I probably don't even know them all. But there are many, and there are great works of history, nonfiction books about real live women who've made a difference in the world. But then there are some of these great writers like Agatha Christie, who's a brilliant woman. And there are books of fiction that are written that are also demonstrate not only great women writers, but they have great stories about freedom too.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for that list. That is going to be so helpful for us. And I'm definitely going to add that Eleni book onto my list. My dad's family left communist Poland, so I love anything about a good book on fighting communism. And then just one last question for you.
Okay, well, there are enough of those. Yeah.
As women, how can we stay civically engaged if we're not necessarily cut out to work in politics?
Well, I think that, again, in any walk of life, there is an important role for leaders. And for instance, I'm a huge advocate for parental choice in education. And that means there are battles to be waged in public schools, in charter schools. Homeschooling is important. Christian schools. So if your thing is education, or you decide your responsibility is going to be a mom, you can be a leader in the education choice movement. And that is huge. But, once you decide that you have principles that are worth fighting for, then you can find what area that you're interested in. And this is something that New can do. Then New can help you decide what your appropriate role is to make a difference. Every individual has a sphere of influence. And part of the role of being a leader for what we believe in is to understand what your sphere of influence is. And it may not be politics at all, and that's probably a good thing. We don't want everybody to be involved in politics. But if you have a particular interest or a particular passion, there's a leadership role for you. And I'll tell you something, any young woman who has joined New is a leader. And everyone might not think of themselves as a leader, but I can tell you, if you went out of your way to join new, you are a leader. And what our responsibility is to help you, to be a mentor to you, is to help you find out what your passion is, and then how to develop your leadership skills so that you can advance principles that are important in your sphere of influence, which is where your passion is.
Mrs. Dunlop, thank you so much. This was so inspirational for me and definitely everyone else that was watching. This was such a great pep talk, and I know especially our chapter leaders are now more excited than ever to hit the ground running and take your advice and put it into action. So thank you so much for everything.
Delighted to, and you know where to find me. If I can help anybody personally, they can reach out to me.